One of the joys of writing a story is becoming involved in the unfolding narrative and experiencing those moments where surprises occur that lead you to take steps that you didn't anticipate taking before. This often results in multiple story arcs expanding out from that core story. The problem is these can sometimes spin out of control. So what do we do about that? How do we as writers maintain that creative outflowing that provides that joy of the craft while still constraining it enough to make a cohesive narrative that comes together for a satisfying conclusion? Go too far one way and you have a story out of control. Go too far the other way and you have a story that is dead. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg, author of Tears from Iron, a fantasy epic focused on a dutiful soldier serving the last surviving civilization in a world racked by chaos, who gradually comes to realize that everything he's been taught since childhood is perhaps not quite as it seems. Okay, so let's talk about story arcs. I actually prefer the term threads, as I think it's a more accurate descriptor as we are weaving the different parts of a story together into a whole pattern. But arcs, threads, they both work. I'm also speaking from the perspective of a discovery writer or a pantser or someone who writes seat of the pants. And that is those of us who don't have a full outline of everything we plan to hit on in the story, but rather develop organically as we go along. If you are not a discovery writer, you may not find this video quite as useful, but you might find some tips and tricks anyway. But if you are, I think you'll find that you're in good company. There are a great many famous, very well-known, well-read authors who are clearly seat-of-the-pants writers. I include in that number George R.R. Martin, who has described writing as heading to a garden and seeing what crops up. I know that Robert Jordan was also a discovery writer for reasons we'll get into in a little bit. And of course, Tolkien was as well. There's a fairly famous story of him bringing the hobbits into the town of Bree, and they meet Strider, and Tolkien doesn't know who Strider is. How can he be more of a discovery writer than that? All three of these are skilled and highly acclaimed authors, but two of them have struggled to bring their stories to a full conclusion. What caused their story arcs to spin out of control? And what can be done to avoid it in your stories? As we get started, I think it's best to look at the two varieties of story threads. If you're less interested in that, you can jump straight to the challenges and solutions. I've got that timestamp below, but I hope you'll continue with me on this journey. First, we have what I would call the Divergent Story. This begins with everyone that the story will follow together at the beginning, and then gradually as the narrative progresses, they branch out and go their separate ways for a time. Generally, they will all come back together at the end or at some point before the end, but they start together and then they diverge. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is the perfect example of this divergent method. Let's take a look at that real quick. Here's a chart that I threw together of the Lord of the Rings. I actually oftentimes do this in my own story to keep track of my threads and to make sure that I have plans. And we'll get into that in a little bit as we go forward, but keep this chart in mind. Now with Lord of the Rings, of course, not all the characters do begin the tale together. We start with just the four hobbits, and then we add on the various members of the Fellowship who become the divergent threads later on. But the significance is that their stories do not begin until Rivendell. We don't go into what Boromir is up to on his journey to Rivendell. It is significant, and the journey is recounted during the council, but we don't actually see that from his point of view. And for that reason, I would not call that a thread. I would call that a backstory, if you will. So the true threads begin with the four hobbits in Hobbiton, and then the 9 walkers in Rivendell. And from there, it begins to branch. That branch, of course, happens at the end of the Fellowship when Pippin and Merry are captured, and you see their branch breaking out there in blue. And then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chase after them, where they meet Gandalf. And Gandalf, once again, I did not make as a separate thread, even though he parts the company in Moria. And that is because we don't follow Gandalf's story in Moria. He's not a divergent thread. He is simply vanishing from the story to reappear later on. And that's the key point here. These divergent threads are story arcs that we follow, where we spend time with the characters, seeing them on their journey away from the main thread, which is Frodo. So ultimately we have all the members of the Fellowship minus Frodo and Sam linking back together at the Orthanc at the end of the Two Towers, where they immediately diverge again. Gandalf and Pippin head off to Minas Tirith, Merry stays with the Riders of Rohan, Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli go off on their journey through the Paths of the Dead. Once again, they will link up at Minas Tirith, and then all march together to the Black Gate, where ultimately the story threads combine for the final time. Now, there are a few interesting points that I would like to observe in the Tolkien example, and the first of these is that the characters don't actually come together physically until the resolution of the story. Yet I would argue that the threads converge in the climax, because while they are not in the same space, the actions that Aragorn and everyone else at the Black Gate are taking are directly related to what Frodo is doing in Mount Doom. The purpose of the Black Gate, of course, being to draw Sauron's eye away from Mount Doom to allow Frodo to succeed. Thus, indeed, each of these plot threads are working together, even if the characters don't necessarily all know it at the time. Frodo and Sam are completely oblivious, and Aragorn and the rest of the Black Gate are acting as a matter of faith and hope, without really being certain if their sacrifice has any meaning. Along the lines of this divergent story, there is another kind of arc that sort of relates, and I would call this one the orbiting method. And this is essentially another variety of the divergent storyline, but it's much tighter. These are smaller departures from the main storyline. I use this method frequently in my current project, Brothers from Flame and Void, which I hope to be getting published here in 2025. And this is a story of a stranded army. So it is a large number of people on the march having various adventures and challenges on the road. And as they travel, subgroups of them depart for a time to scout ahead or to deal with an issue on the periphery or things like that. But they generally are much shorter in length than you see with the Lord of the Rings or other divergent methods. And that's why I call it orbiting. They stay much closer. They're tightly revolving around that main thread. The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Nevin and Jerry Pournelle, which is a story of first contact with an alien species in the far distant future, is another example of this divergent storyline with a twist. I don't want to give too much away, but basically there is a ship that is sent out to make contact with these alien species. A subgroup of that ship's crew gets separated from the crew and have their own adventure. And the twist is that their thread doesn't converge back together again. It exists separately for the primary purpose of educating the reader on things that the reader needs to know about the aliens, but that the authors don't want the characters to know. And so that's a different kind of purpose you can serve with this divergent storyline. With a travel log such as Lord of the Rings or my own project, it is often pretty easy to see these divergent threads and how they separate and come together, things along those lines. They are literally occupying different geographical space. Okay, the second kind of story I would call the convergent story arc. And this is similar, but it has one distinct difference, and that key difference is how the story begins. And it begins with all the different character threads in different locales, initially unrelated to each other, but that grow together by the ending. For example, here, I'm just going to throw a twist in everything, and rather than talk about fantasy literature, I'm going to turn to a TV sitcom from the 90s, and that is Seinfeld, which is a show that was very famous for having stories that started out completely unrelated to each other, that wove together for a final comedic climax. I should also add here an important observation that threads, while often character assigned, like we looked at with Lord of the Rings, or other kinds of travelogues, don't have to be. They are often plot assigned, and as in the Seinfeld example, it is not uncommon for characters to jump across to impact multiple threads. This is something you can do when everyone occupies the same geographical space. But for a deeper dive, I can't help but turn back to fantasy, and so for this we're going to look at Robert Jordan's second book of the Wheel of Time series, The Great Hunt. And in this story, we begin with Rand al'Thor, the main character, and his two friends in the far north. And there's a crisis where a horn is stolen, and they have to go and search for it. Meanwhile, the three women they met along the way in the first book, Egwene, Nynaeve, and Elaine, are at Tar Valon learning to become Aes Sedai. And so they are separated by quite a bit of geographical distance. And they are led out of the tower on a ruse, and ultimately the main thread with Rand and the secondary thread with the Aes Sedai novices all end up completely on the other side of the continent, where they're brought together for the final epic battle that concludes the Great Hunt. I'm not going to dive into this in the same detail as I did with Lord of the Rings, but you kind of get the idea there, where we have these two threads which begin far apart and move closer together. And another example of this would, of course, be George R.R. Martin's A Song of Fire and Ice series, where he does that quite a bit. Of course, books often have both the divergent and the convergent thread models happening side by side, with some of the threads beginning together and branching out and coming back together, while other threads start separate and also join in by the end. And that's also a key point. If these stories don't converge at the end, then you have a problem. You actually have two stories. Now, these convergences don't have to be physical, like in the example of the Black Gate versus Mount Doom, but they do have to be a plot convergence where the two are interrelating and having a significant impact on each other. So that's a commentary on the different kinds of story arcs that we see. Now let's talk about the problems of these story arcs and the solutions. The problem, of course, is that as discovery writers, we oftentimes come across these threads that branch away that we hadn't imagined when we began the story. And they offer enticing and interesting ways to expand and develop and deepen the narrative that we're trying to create. But in doing so, as we add more and more branches, we begin to create a story that becomes so unwieldy that we're not even sure how to put it back together again. But also, as discovery writers, we don't want to deny ourselves that process, because the joy of the discovery writing is the coming across of these threads, these new ideas, and exploring them. So we're kind of caught between that rock and that hard place of wanting to allow the story to emerge organically, but also maintaining a level of control over it that doesn't destroy it. The first solution, which is true in most problems, is avoiding that problem in the first place. Of course, this is easier said than done for us discovery writers, because we want to have that free-flowing unfolding of a story as we discover new threads, new concepts, new ideas. After all, we don't fully structure our stories. That being said, perhaps we should structure it at least a little bit. And the most important part of that structure is to have the end in mind when you begin. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, I know that Robert Jordan is a discovery writer based upon some of the things he said. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him when he visited the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1996, and he gave a small Q&A. And during that Q&A, I don't remember what the question another cadet asked was, but I do recall the answer. And what he said was that even from the very beginning, before he set out writing the Wheel of Time series, he knew the final scene. So he knew exactly the point that he was writing to. And when you have that kind of a focus, that can guide you along the way to help you assess when you're causing problems with your story. Now, of course, Robert Jordan still ran into challenges by ending up with a story that spiraled out of control, particularly, I would say, around book 7 and later, and became something of a challenge to pull back together. But this comes back to the first point. Along with having this end in mind, have an idea of where your story should start getting smaller rather than larger. One of those traditional rules of thumb regarding characters is that all characters should be introduced in the first third or so of a novel. This isn't always possible. That's why it's called a rule of thumb. It's not dogma that you must follow exactly, but it's a good guide to help keeping in mind the fact that introducing characters later in a narrative may cause more problems than if you bring them in earlier on. The same is true with plot threads. As a good rule of thumb, perhaps don't start any new threads after the first third or so of your narrative. Now, again, this isn't always possible, just like it isn't always possible with characters. Maybe there's something important that needs to branch out later on. But when you come across that branch, ask yourself, is it really necessary? Perhaps keep it as a closer branch rather than one which branches very wide. And then also follow the other tips that we'll get into here in a moment. Okay, so the next one is to watch out for mission creep. And mission creep started out as a military term. It described a gradual shift in operational objectives during the course of a military campaign that ultimately broadens and veers the original objective of the mission. It creeps away from what it was supposed to be into something new and perhaps something not as good as it was in the beginning, because the commanders lost track of what their goals were. In writing, this means losing track of that end state that you have in mind. Just because ideas broaden the themes and the tale that you had when you first started the story doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad idea. It doesn't spell doom for your story. But what it does require is a pause. Take a step back and look at your narrative. Does what you've written so far fit and work with the new paradigm? Call all the threads that you've introduced already to mind, and do they still converge into a satisfying ending that your new vision entails? If no, then either axe this new idea that's causing your mission to creep, or rewrite what you've done before so it fits into the new, stronger paradigm. Then the next tip is to recognize if the new branch is damaging your overall story. If it is, you have to prune it. As we've talked about, I think, several times here already, one of the joys of being a discovery writer is to come across these ideas that emerge organically and to follow them during the writing process. This is one of those things that I enjoy most about writing, and it's really what brings me to sit in front of the keyboard and pour my creative spirit into it. But sometimes even these good ideas you come across don't work. And this leads to the solution to this challenge, and that is, don't just write with an end in mind for your novel. Write with an end in mind for each thread of your narrative. As we looked at with the Lord of the Rings example, maybe make one of those charts like I showed you. And for each thread that you have branching away from that main narrative, consider, how am I going to bring that back together again? What is the point in which this new thread converges again with the core? And if you don't have an idea of how that's going to conclude, it's probably not a good thread. If you can't see it, cut it. That being said, we're discovery writers, right? So along the way, as you're developing this new thread, you may realize that there is, in fact, a better way to weave it back into the main narrative. This isn't mission creep. This isn't a evolution of your overall story arc. It's rather a shifting of the convergence. It's a shifting of when that narrative comes home again. While it is common for threads to all come together at the conclusion, it's also at least as common for many threads to come together before the conclusion. After all, the various divergent threads in Lord of the Rings, the only ones that came together at the conclusion or after the conclusion were the other members of the Fellowship with Frodo and Sam. But the other members of the Fellowship, as we talked about, they diverged and converged multiple times before the ending narrative. Before we move on to the conclusion, I do want to take a look back at the bigger picture. And when I say bigger, I mean this in a literal sense of a bigger picture with more and more arcing threads. Because one of the challenges is that the greater the cast you have, the more wayward your threads may become. You can solve this by causing some of those threads to simply be snuffed out. But in their existence and in their snuffing, they must still serve some greater purpose to the story. Developing plot, developing character, or perhaps more rarely, providing the reader with knowledge that you want the audience to know without divulging it to your core characters. On a similar vein, some series may get so large that they don't even appear to have a main thread. I would submit that Steven Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen fits into this model, where the deep story actually takes several books before it really clearly emerges at all for the reader to be aware of. The key here is twofold, though. First, each book is still a cohesive whole. While in the first couple books we didn't know what was happening with the main world thread, the plot and the narrative of that story started and had a discrete finish with its own branching threads, so on and so forth. And so it began and concluded completely, wrapping up its key components as part of that broader whole. Second, while the reader may not be aware that there is a world narrative going on, you as an author have to be aware of that. Like Jordan said, you have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, those books, while they may be great standalone stories, do not form, in fact, a series. These broader world narratives are, of course, much tougher to write than the more straightforward, structurally simple Lord of the Rings. And there actually may be a lesson in that as well. If you're a new author, if you have not explored a lot of the writing process and you're still getting your feet wet, building experience, building that learning, maybe keep your stories more constrained. And as you develop, if you have an idea of one of those world narratives, perhaps work on that later on. But starting small is not necessarily a bad idea to help you develop and hone all those other skills that are required for writing. So let's wrap this up. What have we talked about? So we started by looking at the different kinds of story threads. We have the diverging method, where the narrative starts with everyone together and they gradually branch out. We have the converging method where everyone starts separate and comes together. Of course, mini stories have both. And also within the diverging method, we oftentimes have uh, a much tighter, more of an orbital sort of threads where there's a small branch that happens briefly for a chapter or two or three before coming back together again. In all of these, though, there must be some sort of convergence or conclusion to those story threads that you're not just leaving dangling for the reader to be baffled by and frustrated with. Ultimately, our goal, of course, is to be telling one of those great narrative stories that we discover through the process of the craft of writing without snuffing out the very magic that keeps these stories alive. And so for the solutions to solving these kinds of problems, first we have the avoidance, right with the end of your story in mind, so you can avoid those branches that are actually ultimately going to cause you a problem in the end. Second, watch out for mission creep. Make sure that your story stays on target to the narrative conclusion that you want to have. And if it begins to creep, reassess to see what you need to do. Do you need to either change your mission and fix everything that you've already done, or cut out this new aberration which is causing the mission to change and the challenge in the first place? Next, we have recognize if a branch is damaging the overall story, and if so, cut it. Even if you love it, you got to cut it. And then finally, we looked a little bit at the bigger picture. The broader, the wider the scope of your story, the more likely you are to run into these challenges. And so it may be that a tighter story is a better solution for you. Know yourself and know what you can handle, know where your skills are at, and act accordingly. So I hope that you found this discussion interesting, enlightening, and helpful. If you did, please offer your comments. I always love to hear what you think about the ideas that I put forth. Maybe I forgot a good tip. Go ahead and throw that in the comments. And if you like this channel, please subscribe to see new content coming in the future. Thank you, and have a good day.